The farmer had always been a quiet man, his silence mistaken for weakness. At the market, while others haggled and bragged, he kept to himself, his eyes lowered, his hands rough from endless work on soil that gave little in return. The townsfolk mocked him openly, laughing at the way he stood apart, as if his silence made him less of a man. Their jeers rang across the stalls, sharper than any blade. Yet he endured them without a word, his dignity intact even as his heart carried the weight of scorn. That day, the sheriff himself joined in the laughter, his booming voice echoing through the square. "A man with no voice has no power," he declared, drawing cheers from the crowd. The farmer said nothing, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the ground. He left with his meager supplies, the sound of ridicule trailing him like dust on the wind. To the town, it was just another day of amusement at the expense of a man they thought beneath them. To the farmer, it was another wound added to years of quiet humiliation. But the West had a way of testing hearts in silence before revealing their strength. That night, the plains carried whispers that few could hear, whispers of debts owed, of kindness remembered, of alliances forged not in markets or saloons, but in moments of unseen sacrifice. The farmer, though mocked, had once shared his bread, his fire, his shelter with those the town had cast aside. His silence was not emptiness, it was patience. And patience, in the wild expanse of the frontier, often hid a deeper power than words. The following morning, as the sheriff rode out with his men, they found their path blocked. 100 warriors, fierce and unyielding, stood across the road, their presence like a wall of living steel against the rising sun. The same market that had laughed at the farmer now buzzed with shock, whispers spreading faster than wildfire. The silent man they had mocked was not alone. His quiet strength had summoned allies none of them could have imagined. In that moment, the story of the farmer shifted forever. He was no longer the subject of ridicule, no longer the man whose silence made him an easy target. His name, unspoken until then, carried the weight of respect as the people realized the truth. Silence had not been weakness, but wisdom. And wisdom, when tested, could summon a force strong enough to silence an entire town. The market had always been a stage for laughter at the farmer's expense, but after that morning, when warriors blocked the sheriff's road, the air in town was different. Whispers chased through the crowd like tumbleweeds, sharp and urgent. No one dared mock him now, for fear that even their words might summon more riders from the horizon. The silent farmer, once treated as invisible, had become the center of every gaze, every speculation, every fearful glance over his shoulder. The sheriff, humiliated before his men, swore revenge beneath his breath. His pride had been cut deeper than any wound, and pride in the West was a dangerous thing. But he also knew he faced a force larger than himself. 100 warriors were no idle threat. They were a wall of defiance, a reminder that the farmer's silence had never meant weakness. He had debts of loyalty etched into the very fabric of the plains, and those debts had now been called upon. Neighbors who once laughed at him in the market now avoided his eyes, ashamed of their cruelty. Some even approached his land quietly, offering food or supplies, hoping to mend bridges that had long been burned by their ridicule. The farmer accepted without a word, his silence as steady as ever, though within him stirred a storm. He had never asked for recognition, but now it had come at a price. The peace of his solitude was gone, and in its place stood a reckoning. The childless widows, the hungry travelers, the outcasts, those he had once helped in secret, came forward, their voices trembling as they spoke of his kindness. Stories spread of the bread he had shared, of the roof he had offered during storms, of the fire that had warmed those who had no home. Each tale was a revelation, a puzzle piece forming an image the town had been blind to. The quiet farmer had carried the weight of many lives in silence, asking for nothing in return. The sheriff, however, saw none of this as virtue. To him, the farmer's silence was rebellion, his allies a challenge to authority. The market became a place of unease, a powder keg waiting for a spark, and the townsfolk, caught between shame and fear, braced themselves for the storm they knew was coming. At dawn the next day, the farmer walked through the village with his head held neither high nor low. He was the same as he had always been, yet every pair of eyes followed him, as though he had transformed into something more than a man. Mothers pulled their children close, and merchants lowered their voices when he passed, each aware that the road they traveled was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the silent man who had summoned 100 warriors with nothing but his past deeds. The sheriff stood at the center of town, his jaw tight, his hand resting near his holster. His authority had always been absolute, but now cracks showed in his control. He barked orders at his men, but their eyes betrayed hesitation, for they had seen the wall of warriors the day before and knew that force could not scatter them. To confront the farmer now would mean risking a war that no badge could contain. The farmer paused at the well, lowering the bucket with the same steady rhythm as always. Children peeked from behind doorframes, their voices hushed, whispering of the man who had become larger than legend overnight. The farmer said nothing, his silence thicker than any speech, but his presence spoke volumes. He did not need to boast, for the land itself carried his story now, and every rustle of the wind seemed to echo his quiet defiance. Whispers turned into speculation. Some claimed the warriors had sworn a blood oath to him, others that he had saved their lives in battles no one dared speak of. Each rumor painted him as something different, a savior, a danger, a mystery. The truth lay hidden beneath his silence, and that uncertainty unsettled the sheriff more than any open threat could have. By evening, the market was hushed, the laughter gone, replaced by tension so sharp it could be felt in every breath. The town had once mocked him for being voiceless, but now his silence commanded them. It was no longer emptiness, it was power, and power in the West was never left unchallenged. By the third day, the sheriff could no longer hide his bitterness. Each glance toward the farmer was a reminder of his humiliation, and pride gnawed at him like a coyote on bone. He gathered his deputies at the saloon, whispering plans laced with anger, promising that order would be restored, even if it meant blood. Yet beneath their hard stares lingered hesitation. The image of 100 warriors blocking the road haunted them still, and loyalty to the sheriff wavered in the face of such power. The townsfolk sensed the shift, their lives caught in the current of a conflict, not yet spoken aloud but heavy in every breath. Mothers hushed their children, merchants bartered quickly, and the once lively market fell into uneasy silence whenever the farmer walked by. His presence, steady and quiet, had become a kind of shadow over the town, not a threat, but a reminder of forces greater than law or ridicule. The farmer himself remained unchanged on the surface, his silence a shield against the rising storm. Yet within him stirred unease, for he had never sought power or confrontation. His only crime had been kindness, his only rebellion patience. Still, he understood now that the West was a land where kindness carried consequences, and his past acts of mercy had woven a net of loyalty stronger than the sheriff's badge. That evening, the villagers gathered in hushed groups, speaking of the farmer as though he were legend already. Some admired him, others feared him, but none dismissed him anymore. He had become the figure every story in town revolved around, the man whose silence had summoned warriors and shifted the balance of power in a single day. But legends are dangerous things in a land built on pride and survival. The sheriff, cornered by shame and desperation, resolved that the farmer's silence could no longer go unanswered. The storm he prepared to unleash would test not only the farmer, but the very soul of the town itself. The next morning broke with a heavy sky, clouds dragging shadows across the plains. The farmer rose early, tending his land as always, the steady rhythm of his work unchanged despite the tension mounting around him. The childlike innocence of daily chores, the bucket at the well, the rows of soil beneath his hands, stood in stark contrast to the gathering storm. His silence was not denial, but defiance, a refusal to let fear dictate his every breath. The sheriff arrived at the market flanked by deputies, his hand resting on his revolver. His voice carried across the square, calling the townsfolk to gather. Law will not bow to silence, he declared, his words sharp as iron. But the crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking toward the horizon, as if expecting once again to see warriors appear at the edge of the land. His speech, meant to inspire confidence, instead revealed desperation. The farmer appeared then, walking slowly through the market with the same calm that had always defined him. He said nothing, offered no challenge, yet every step carried a weight heavier than words. The people parted to let him pass, their whispers swallowed by the hush that followed him. His silence, once mocked, now silenced even the sheriff's booming voice. The sheriff's hand tightened on his holster, his pride demanding action, yet his instincts screamed caution. For the first time, the townsfolk wondered aloud if the sheriff's authority was crumbling. In that fragile silence, the farmer's presence stood taller than any weapon, his quiet defiance stronger than the badge pinned to the sheriff's chest. By dusk, the town understood what the sheriff could not admit. The balance of power had shifted. The silent farmer no longer stood alone, for behind him stretched not only 100 warriors, but also the unspoken loyalty of every heart that had witnessed his quiet strength. And the sheriff, trapped between pride and fear, prepared for a reckoning he could no longer avoid. By the 5th day, the sheriff's frustration had hardened into fury. His pride, wounded in front of the townsfolk, demanded action, and his deputies, though hesitant, followed his orders with grim obedience. Posters appeared at the saloon and at the market, declaring that law would no longer tolerate defiance, and that silence, no matter how strong, would bow to the badge. The farmer's name was not written, but everyone knew whom the words were meant for. The townspeople whispered in corners, torn between fear and loyalty. Some remembered how they had once mocked the farmer, ashamed now of their cruelty. Others, still clinging to old habits, muttered that no man could stand against the sheriff forever. But beneath the surface, the mood was shifting. The sight of 100 warriors had planted seeds of doubt about the sheriff's power, and those seeds were beginning to grow into quiet resistance. The farmer carried on with his work as if nothing had changed. He moved through his fields, fed his animals, and tended his home with the same steady rhythm as always. Yet his silence no longer felt like isolation. It was now a shield, a statement stronger than any shouted words. To those watching from a distance, every step he took was an act of defiance, his calm presence more threatening to the sheriff than any weapon could be. That evening, a stranger approached his land. He bore no weapon, only a warning. The sheriff was gathering men, not just deputies but outlaws and drifters who owed him favors. The farmer listened without a word, nodding once before turning back to his work. The stranger left unsettled, for he expected fear, but found only a quiet resolve in the man he had come to warn. As the sun fell, the farmer sat by the fire, the crackling flames casting shadows on the walls. He thought of the road ahead, of the storm gathering around him. The West had tested him with ridicule, but now it would test him with force. And though the odds were stacked against him, he knew he would not face them alone. The following morning, the sheriff made his move. He rode into the market with more than a dozen men at his back, their faces hardened, their hands close to their guns. The air grew heavy with dread as shopkeepers closed shutters and families hurried their children indoors. The sheriff dismounted, his boots striking the dirt with deliberate force, each step a declaration that law, his law, would not be mocked again. He called out for the farmer in a booming voice that echoed across the square. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye turned toward the road, waiting, watching. And then, as if the land itself answered, the farmer appeared, walking slowly into the heart of town. His stride was calm, his face unreadable, his silence cutting deeper than any insult or challenge. The sheriff sneered, spitting words meant to provoke. You hide behind your silence, behind the shadows of others. But today, you'll answer to me. His hand hovered near his revolver, the promise of violence trembling in the air. The crowd held its breath, caught between fear of the sheriff's rage and awe of the farmer's unshaken calm. And then, before a shot could be fired, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. Dust rose on the horizon as warriors appeared once more, their formation unbreakable, their presence undeniable. 100 strong, they descended like a living storm, surrounding the market, their silent allegiance falling upon the sheriff like a weight he could not lift. The townsfolk gasped, their fear of the farmer now replaced by reverence. The sheriff, pale with rage and humiliation, realized too late the truth. The silent farmer had built something he could never destroy. His silence was no weakness. It was power, earned through loyalty, kindness, and quiet strength. The sheriff's hand hovered at his holster, but for the first time in his reign of authority, hesitation clouded his eyes. Before him stood not only the silent farmer, but also the living wall of 100 warriors whose presence turned the market into a fortress. The crowd that once laughed at the farmer now shifted back in awe, their whispers replaced by the kind of silence born from fear and reverence alike. The farmer did not raise a weapon. He did not need to. His silence alone spoke louder than the sheriff's threats. The sheriff shouted, his words brittle against the weight of the scene. "This is my town, my law." But his voice cracked beneath the unflinching gaze of the people. No longer did the villagers look to him for order. They looked to the silent man who had endured ridicule without striking back, who had given without asking in return, who now stood guarded by allies summoned not with bribes, but with loyalty earned over years. One of the deputies, trembling with doubt, lowered his gun and stepped back. Another followed, unwilling to cross a man protected by a force greater than law. The sheriff's grip tightened, but as his men faltered, his authority crumbled like dust in the wind. The people saw it too. The lawman who once commanded with fear was now alone in his pride, while the farmer, in silence, commanded devotion. The warriors said nothing, their faces unreadable, their weapons steady but unused. They had not come to fight. They had come to stand, to shield, to prove that one man's quiet integrity was worth more than a sheriff's pride. The message was clear. If a shot was fired, it would not be one man against another, but one lawman against 100 unyielding wills. The farmer's eyes, calm and steady, met the sheriff's across the square. He did not move, he did not speak, but in that gaze was a challenge no bullet could answer. The West, vast and merciless, was watching, and it would remember not who shouted loudest, but who stood firmest. The standoff stretched into eternity, the market frozen in breathless silence. The sheriff, his pride warring with his survival, felt the weight of 100 stares pressing him into submission. His voice, once booming, now wavered as he barked at the farmer to stand down. But the words rang hollow, echoing weakly against the wall of loyalty surrounding his enemy. The townsfolk began to shift, not away from the farmer, but closer to him. A merchant who once mocked him now stood behind his shoulder, and then another, until slowly, subtly, the silent man was no longer alone. The sheriff realized with horror that power was slipping from his grasp, not because of violence, but because of choice. The people had chosen. At last, the sheriff's hand fell from his gun. He spat into the dust, his jaw clenched, his pride bleeding out in silence. Without another word, he turned on his heel and mounted his horse. His deputies followed reluctantly, shame heavy in their eyes. The crowd exhaled as if freed from a grip, the sound of hooves fading into the distance, leaving behind not victory, but transformation. The warriors remained, their presence steady until the last rider disappeared beyond the hills. Only then did they disperse, fading back into the plains as silently as they had arrived. The market buzzed with awe, every word spoken a tribute to the farmer who had stood without speaking, who had turned ridicule into reverence, and who had changed the fate of the town without raising his voice or his weapon. The farmer walked home in silence, just as he always had. But this time, the silence carried weight, not of loneliness, but of legend. The man once mocked at the market was now a symbol, his story etched into the dust and carried on the wind, a reminder that in the West, true power often speaks without words. The days that followed carried a quiet transformation. The farmer continued his routine as though nothing had changed, tending his land, walking to the well, moving through the town with the same steady silence. Yet everywhere he went, eyes followed him differently now. No longer filled with ridicule, they carried respect, awe, and a hint of fear. He had not lifted a hand in violence, yet he had brought the sheriff to his knees. In a land where strength was measured by gun and voice, his silence had proven stronger than both. The townsfolk began to approach him cautiously, offering greetings they had never bothered with before. A merchant who once mocked his silence now pressed fresh bread into his hands. Children who had laughed at him now ran at his side, their eyes wide with wonder, asking him to tell them the secret of how he had called 100 warriors. He gave no answer, only a quiet nod, and in his silence the mystery grew even deeper. The sheriff, humiliated and broken, vanished from the market. Though his badge still hung heavy on his chest, it no longer carried weight in the eyes of the people. His deputies scattered, his voice silenced not by law or bullet, but by the quiet power of the man he had once mocked. The town had shifted, its order rewritten, its loyalties reshaped not by force, but by respect freely given to the one who had endured in silence. Each evening, the farmer sat on his porch, the horizon glowing red as the sun sank behind the hills. The land seemed to bow with him, the endless plains humming with a peace he had not known before. For years, silence had been his burden, but now it had become his strength, his shield, his legend. What had once been loneliness was now legacy, whispered across the town, carried into the hills, and etched into the memory of all who had witnessed it. But, deep down, the farmer understood that the West was never finished testing a man. Peace was fragile, and respect could turn as swiftly as the wind. Still, he faced the uncertainty not with fear, but with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through mockery and confrontation. His silence would remain his greatest weapon, for it had already proven stronger than bullets, stronger than law, stronger than pride. Weeks passed, and the story of the silent farmer spread far beyond the borders of the town. Travelers carried the tale to distant settlements, painting him as a figure larger than life. Some called him a prophet of the plains, others a rebel cloaked in patience. But to those who knew him, he was simply the man who had endured ridicule, who had lived quietly and faithfully until the day his silence turned the course of history. The market, once a place of humiliation, became his arena of quiet triumph. Every step he took through its dusty lanes was a reminder of how quickly scorn can turn to reverence. The same men who had laughed now lowered their heads in respect, and the same sheriff who had mocked him had become little more than a fading memory of arrogance defeated. The farmer himself never changed. He did not boast, he did not seek power, and he did not wield his influence for gain. His life remained as it had always been, tending to his land, helping those in need, and walking in silence. But that silence, once mistaken for weakness, now carried weight that no law, no weapon, and no ridicule could break. Each evening, as the horizon burned with twilight fire, the farmer stood at the edge of his land, listening to the whispers carried by the wind. They were not whispers of mockery anymore. They were stories, legends, lessons. His silence had become a language of its own, one that the West would never forget. And so, the man once mocked at the market stood tall in history, not because of words shouted or battles fought, but because he had proven a truth the West had long forgotten, that sometimes the loudest voice belongs to the one who never speaks. The town that once mocked the silent farmer would never forget the day their laughter turned into awe. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, had risen as a force stronger than any weapon, stronger even than the badge of the sheriff. What they saw was not a man defeated by ridicule, but one who transformed scorn into strength, proving that in the vast and merciless West, dignity and patience could stand taller than pride and violence. For the first time, the villagers realized that power did not always roar in anger or echo in gunfire. It could also whisper in stillness, carried by a man whose deeds had spoken long before anyone chose to listen. The farmer's life, built on quiet sacrifice and kindness given in secret, had become a fortress when the world turned against him. In his silence, he had forged alliances and earned loyalty, showing that respect is not demanded, but earned in the shadows of hardship. As the dust settled and the sheriff's threats faded into the horizon, the truth lingered. The farmer had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the world often underestimates the ones who endure without complaint. His silence was no longer a burden. It was a legacy, one that carried lessons deeper than words could ever reach. The story of his defiance would travel across the plains, etched into the memory of all who had witnessed it. The West, with its cruelty and chaos, had tested him with loneliness, humiliation, and danger. Yet he had faced it all without bending, proving that the strongest voices are sometimes those never raised. His journey whispered to every heart that heard it. Never mistake quiet strength for weakness, for when the time comes, it may be the very thing that changes the course of destiny. And now, as you carry this story with you, take a moment to reflect. What would you have done in his place? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let your voice become part of this tale. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel to hear more unforgettable legends of courage, silence, and redemption from the Old West. And don't forget to like the video, so these stories continue to echo across the horizon, reminding us all of the strength hidden in the quietest hearts.